أردتم أن تكونوا شامة بين الورى فاختفوا آثار جيل للمعالي سطرا إن أردتم أن تكونوا شامة.
But it'll be a presentation on a very misunderstood topic in this day and age. I would say misunderstood amongst Muslims, misunderstood amongst certainly those who are not Muslim. And before I kind of continue on this, I mean, first and foremost, the word Sharia needs to be defined. It sounds like a very alien Arabic word, but really it just means law. So when people use the word Sharia law, in effect they're just saying law. We would say that, for example, English law is English Sharia, for example, and French law is French Sharia, and so on. So Sharia just means law, although it linguistically means path, a pathway, but it's used in the context of law. Now, before I kind of go into a few misconceptions, I'll start with a few misconceptions, and I'll actually discuss the main substance of Sharia law, what it aims to achieve, its kind of principles and policies. The reason why I say it's been misunderstood or misconceived is due to a lot of historical issues which have occurred in the last 200 to 300 years. The Islamic civilization, when we think of, let's say, the Cordoba, the Caliphate of Cordoba, Baghdad, Cairo and Istanbul, in the medieval times, we would imagine a very enlightened, well, most of us, if we study the history on this matter, would see very enlightened times. There was Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists, all living side by side. There was no intolerance. People had open public debates. It was free, open intellectual discussion, scientific development and technology. And what people they don't connect the dots in their mind to think, well, why was that the case? Why was it in medieval times? So this was during Europe's dark ages. You saw such a very pluralistic, very tolerant and very advanced society in all manners. And yet, whenever someone intones the word Sharia now, it invokes in the minds of many non-Muslims and even Muslims as well, the Taliban or ISIS or Boko Haram or Saudi Arabia. But you compare ISIS, Taliban, Saudi Arabia to the caliphates of Cordoba and Baghdad and Istanbul throughout history, and you'll see a vast difference. And yet they were in the medieval times, and they were applying Sharia law like anyone else. So why we see this disparity? What happened to create the very modern phenomena of these groups, Taliban, Saudi Arabia, and others? And if you just look at history, I mean, and just look at recent times, they've emerged out of a context, and the context was colonialization. I would also argue that the Muslim civilization degraded over time due to success in the 1600s. 15 to 1600s, the Islamic civilization reached its peak. It was developed. It had social, military, and political dominance in many regions of the world, and it just rested on its laurels and just rested on its wealth and didn't develop. It wasn't as dynamic. It stopped being dynamic. It stopped being. Its industries decreased. It had industry. It just decreased, and it was content to outsource manufacturing to the West, and just to buy manufactured goods from the West, and they stopped being the source of manufactured goods, for example, which sounds familiar. Sounds like America and China relationship now, actually. So over many hundreds of years, Muslims, I would argue, we reached an intellectual malaise due to civilizational success. And it wasn't just us, the Chinese civilization as well was a very powerful, very advanced and developed civilization. They too reached a civilizational malaise due to their success. They invented clocks, and yet in the 18th, 1900s, the Europeans were selling them clocks to China, the birthplace of I think, water clocks. So we see that there was this shift. But what also happened with the civilizational malaise, which occurred, is intellectually speaking, the Muslims, we ourselves, our intellectual understanding of Islam declined. But that wasn't the major cause of what you see today. added to the fact that due to civilizational decline, technological decline, and therefore Europeans who took Islamic teachings and learning, it created their Renaissance, and then later on it created their Enlightenment, and then they came to our countries and our parts of the world with superior technology. They conquered, they exploited resources, and they changed the education system of many of these Muslim countries. So India, Egypt. In one case, for example, in Egypt, women were practicing in medicine. They were doctors, and according to Victorian era social mores and values, this was an affront that women should be practicing, medicine. They should be nurses at best, or they should be housewives. And so the Victorians actually shut down women's education in Egypt in the medical profession, where previously under Islamic times they had access to that education, and actually confined them to more of the housewife role. In fact, a lot of ideas in the Muslim world right now are Victorian era ideas. The recent, or a couple of years ago, there was, and there still is, discussions about the blasphemy law in Pakistan. I always use that as an example because it's been cited. I look at how many people are falling foul of blasphemy laws in Pakistan. Yet the blasphemy law itself was borrowed from the British Empire 100 years ago. I mean, its formulation is virtually identical to that one formulated by the British. I mean, the Pakistanis and the people in the region, they basically borrowed from what was the most dominant civilization at the time, the one that had previously colonized their territories, which is the British Empire. Egypt as well. So many of our laws are borrowed from Napoleonic constitutions, various European constitutions. These laws actually are what would be European laws 100 years ago. So a lot of the countries you see today are Victorian colonial era constructs. And a lot of their understandings of Islam, because the education system was changed, are Muslims looking through Islam as the Victorians or as Europeans would look at Islam. So we're looking at ourselves via the lens of the civilization which actually came to colonialize us, which create a lot of distortions in the Islamic understanding. And I'll just give you one example before I go into the main meat of the Sharia law discussion. So I always cite the example, and this recently comes up, about the issue of homosexuality and homosexuals. We see this term cited by many professed Muslim scholars. We see it cited by the West. It's now become an accepted term to use. And the discussion about illegality of homosexuality centers around the term homosexual and homosexuality, which completely has skewed the entire debate into a fallacy, and basically with one side defending one straw man and another side criticizing a straw man of a concept. In Islamic texts, legal texts, heck, in biblical texts, in Latin, in any civilization's language until the 19th century, there was no word for homosexual or homosexuality. No word at all. Didn't exist. The concept of categorizing people by their sexual preference was unknown. It was a very modern invention, a Victorian era invention. Actually, it was invented in Germany, I believe. And then it became popular in Europe when they tried to categorize people. And when they started to categorize people by their sexual proclivity or the sexual preference, then discrimination of them began because they were classified. Now, how do you deal with these people who have been classified in such a manner, and they were treated as they had mental problems, they were insane, and they were, in many places they were made illegal, and you couldn't admit that you're homosexual, otherwise you'd go to jail or go to a mental institution. In Europe, this was Europe, but in the Muslim world, we learned of homosexuality from European colonial education system. We learned about the classification, and then what you saw was Muslims adopting the Victorian era understanding of it, and then treating it the same as they learned from the West. So when you see the persecution against homosexuals, this is actually the Muslim world having learned from the West. We just haven't updated the curriculum yet from the West, but it was something that came from the West, didn't come from Islam. The Islamic understanding towards people who have, towards human beings is that the issue is actions, not tastes. and the aspects of the political Sharia, the application of Sharia, it doesn't root out or find people who practice whatever they want to do in private. What we consider whatever you do in private is between you and God. What the Sharia restricts is public lewdness, so basically fornication or extramarital sex in public, on the streets. And according to British law as well, you can't do that either. You can't go out and commit lewdness on the streets. And what I mean by lewdness, I mean, actual intercourse, not holding hands or what have you. This is, again, very, very European. Heck, in most Islamic cultures, you'll find that, well, not Islamic cultures, but just cultures which exist with majority Muslim populations, like Arab culture or Asian culture. Guys hold hands and kiss each other on the cheek, or even in some cases on the lips or on the nose in some parts of the Khalij, the Arabian Peninsula. And it's not viewed as being gay or camp or anything like this. It's just viewed as an expression of love, of platonic love between males or women to women. It's not viewed in a sexual manner. So we don't have this idea of campness or acting gay, quote unquote. It's, again, all European imports to us. So what Islam does prohibit, theologically or speaking, between us and God is the act of same-gender intercourse. The activity, not desires. Desires, you're not penalized in Islam for desires. We're not Catholicism in that sense. And all humans have what we'd consider to be sinful desires to do actions which Islam considers to be sinful, or Revelation considers to be sinful. So you can't then classify certain people by saying you are reprobate, or you have to be rooted out because you have sinful desires, because all human beings have sinful desires. The only difference is what particular desire you have which is sinful, and for example, a Muslim who might fancy alcohol but never doesn't drink alcohol, but might fancy drinking alcohol, that's a sinful desire. It doesn't mean we now classify them as the alcoholic and try to root them out or send them to mental hospitals or so on and so forth. We don't have that approach, because we don't classify human beings by their tastes. So in essence, we don't discriminate homosexuals because we don't discriminate homosexuals. Quite literally, we don't discriminate them between any other person or any other people. We don't make a certain category, and we don't say this is a label and this comes with a culture, gay culture, and you're now straitjacketed into this particular expectation of how you must be, which again happens in the West. In Islam, it doesn't exist. All this was European imports from colonial era times. So we don't persecute, prosecute, or execute homosexuals because we don't even have a label or a classification to discriminate them with in the first place. Everyone's just human, and we're all sinful humans with sinful desires. But having a sinful desire doesn't mean you are a reprobate or you are going to deserve punishment, because we all have sinful desires. The only question is what your conscience believes and how you choose to act, whether you choose to act on your conscience or not according to what you believe. That is what you're judged on. You're not judged on desires. So that's just one small example of a misconception which we just take for granted, and yet is a completely alien concept to Islam. But even Muslim scholars or jurisprudence have adopted it from, again, colonial era times. And when you see ISIS, when you see Taliban, when you see Saudi Arabia, when you see that whole idea that women should stay in their homes or be housewives, all Victorian era concepts, which we took from the Victorians and how they acted and how they believed men and women should act. And they were very strong Christians. Whether they were following traditional Christianity or whether whether Victorian Christianity itself was very modern is a different discussion for a different day. But we borrowed, unfortunately, from our colonializers. So now going back to Sharia law. So what is Sharia law? It is a law system, we believe, which emanates from revelation, and it emanates from the aspects of revelation that deal with human actions and activities. Now, while in Muslims and Islam being what we believe is the most recent revelation from God, we believe that obviously Christianity is a revelation from God, and Judaism is a revelation from God, and that every civilization at some point in its history has had